It was supposed to be a normal day in court. Just another hearing, another defendant, another case. The courtroom was packed, quiet except for the shuffling of papers and low murmurs of legal teams. In walked a young black man, calm but serious, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and carrying himself with quiet strength. He wasn't here to cause a scene, he was just doing his job. But what no one in that courtroom expected was that by the end of that morning, the very judge presiding over the case would be the one in handcuffs, and he would be the one arresting her. She sat high behind the bench, stern-faced and sharp-tongued. Known around town for being tough in court, she had a reputation, but not the good kind. Whispers followed her wherever she went, rumors of unfair treatment, biased comments, a cold demeanor toward people who didn't look like her, but in a position of power, she'd gone unchecked for years. That morning, her target was the young man standing before her. What she didn't know was that he wasn't just another defendant. He was an undercover federal agent, placed there for a reason. The tension in the room crackled as she began questioning him, her voice laced with condescension. Every word she spoke dug deeper, her tone dripping with subtle insults and overt disrespect. Some in the room exchanged glances, others stared down at their shoes. The bailiff looked uncomfortable, but the young man didn't flinch. He stood tall, speaking, with clarity and confidence. Still, the judge pressed harder, letting her prejudice show in ways that made everyone watching uneasy. The energy in the room shifted. Something big was coming. But let's hit pause for just a second, because that courtroom twist is only half the story. Earlier that same morning, on a packed city bus just a few blocks away, another story was quietly unfolding. A young black teenager, probably no older than 17, was heading to school. He had headphones in, backpack slung over one shoulder, and looked like he hadn't had much sleep. As the bus pulled up to the next stop, a visibly pregnant white woman stepped on. There were no open seats, and no one made a move to stand. Without hesitation, the teen stood up and offered his seat, a soft smile on his face. She thanked him, surprised but grateful, and sat down. She kept glancing at him as the bus moved along. Something about him struck her. Maybe it was the kindness in his eyes. Maybe it was how rare it felt to be treated with simple respect. A few minutes later, as her stop approached, she pulled a folded note from her purse and handed it to him quietly before stepping off the bus. "Read it later," she said softly. What he read changed everything. These two moments, one in a tense courtroom, the other on a moving bus, were completely unrelated. At first glance, just random stories in a big city. But sometimes life has a way of connecting people and moments in ways no one sees coming. So what happened in that courtroom? What did the note say? And how did this young man go from being insulted to putting the judge in cuffs just 7 minutes later? Keep watching, because this story is just getting started. The courtroom was still, the kind of stillness that creeps in when people don't quite know what to say, or if they're even allowed to speak. The judge looked down from her bench, clearly irritated but trying to keep the edge out of her voice. The young man, Marcus, stood quietly, hands at his sides, eyes steady. His calmness seemed to bother her even more. She leaned forward, narrowed her eyes, and asked a question that wasn't really about the case at all. Something personal, something that made a few people in the gallery lift their heads in disbelief. Marcus didn't react. He just responded, like a professional, clear, polite, no trace of emotion. But the words coming from the bench kept crossing lines. Small ones at first, but they added up quickly. She questioned his credentials, his background, even his appearance. She made comments that felt unnecessary, sarcastic, even mocking. Anyone paying attention could feel it. It wasn't just about the law anymore. She was trying to humiliate him, break him down, and she had no idea who she was talking to. See, Marcus wasn't there by accident. He was part of a quiet internal investigation, sent in to observe a pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked for years. The department had received anonymous complaints about this judge, comments that suggested racial bias, strange sentencing patterns, and behavior behind the scenes that raised serious red flags. But no one had been able to prove anything. Until now, Marcus had gone through special training for this. He knew how to handle pressure. He knew how to stay calm even when things got personal. What he didn't expect, though, was just how open the judge would be in her disrespect. It was like she thought she was untouchable, like no one would ever call her out. And for a long time, maybe that had been true. But the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, across town, that same folded note burned a hole in a teenage boy's pocket. His name was Jamal. He'd tucked the paper into his backpack without thinking much of it, figuring it was maybe just a polite thank you or a kind message. But after he got off the bus and headed into school, something about the woman's expression stuck with him. She hadn't looked like she was just being nice. She looked serious, nervous even. Jamal waited until lunch to pull out the note. He opened it slowly, expecting a short sentence or two. What he found instead was a full-page letter, written in careful handwriting. The first few lines made his stomach drop. It wasn't just about the bus ride. She had recognized him. She knew something about his past, something he thought had been buried. But instead of threatening him or accusing him, the note was filled with empathy. And at the very bottom, a phone number, followed by 6 words. Call me. I can help. You. He folded the note up quickly, heart racing. How did she know who he was? How could she help him? And most of all, why him? Back in the courtroom, Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. 7 minutes had passed since the judge had started her questioning. 7 minutes of carefully veiled insults and unprofessional jabs. And now her voice was rising, her tone sharpening. You think you're qualified to be here? She asked, not bothering to hide her disdain anymore. You walk in here like you belong on my level. Marcus remained still. Then quietly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small badge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He just stepped forward, showed the badge to the bailiff, and said calmly, You're going to want to take her into custody. There was a beat of silence. The bailiff looked confused at first, then shocked. The judge froze, her eyes wide. What is this? She demanded, her voice cracking slightly now. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the court reporter and handed over a document. This is a federal warrant, he said, signed and authorized this morning. You've been under investigation for judicial misconduct, and as of now, you're being placed under arrest. Gasps echoed through the room. Some people stood, others just sat, stunned, trying to take in what they were seeing. The judge, who, moments ago, had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now being read her rights by the same man she had tried to belittle. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Still, questions hung in the air. What exactly had the judge done? How long had this investigation been going on? And how had Marcus managed to stay undercover for so long without tipping her off? Even as she was led out of the courtroom, her expression was hard to read. Somewhere, between disbelief and fury. But Marcus wasn't focused on that anymore. His job was done. What mattered now was what would come next. Because exposing one person is never the end of the story. It's usually just the beginning. And across town, Jamal still hadn't decided if he was going to call the number on the note. He sat in the back of his math class, the note tucked under his textbook, his mind a million miles away from the equation on the board. His gut told him this wasn't just some random act of kindness. The woman had known something important. But how? And more importantly, could he trust her? The more he thought about it, the more he started to wonder if his past was finally catching up with him, or if, maybe for the first time, his future was finally opening up. One courtroom, one bus ride, 2 lives, changed forever in a single morning, and neither of them had seen it coming. The moment the judge was escorted out of the courtroom, a strange silence took over the room. It wasn't just shock. It was like everyone was processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of the roles flipping in front of their eyes. A few people pulled out their phones, but most just stared at Marcus as he calmly stepped away from the center of the room. He didn't need to say anything else. The truth had already spoken loud enough. But even outside the courtroom, the tension didn't disappear. Word of the arrest traveled fast. News vans parked outside the courthouse within the hour, reporters swarming for a statement. Nobody had expected the judge to be exposed like that. Not in front of everyone, not so publicly. People were already debating online, some calling it justice, others calling it staged. But behind all the noise, Marcus knew the real story was deeper. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was part of something much larger, something he was only beginning to uncover. Back at the precinct, the investigation team was already combing through files, case after case, looking for patterns. There were sealed records, confidential complaints, and more than a few names that started showing up again and again. Lawyers, officers, even other judges. It was clear that what Marcus had witnessed in that courtroom was only a piece of the puzzle. And if they were going to bring the whole picture into the light, they'd need more than evidence. They'd need people willing to talk. People who had seen what happened but were too afraid to speak up before. Marcus found himself thinking about the young intern who had first tipped off the agency. An anonymous letter, typed and mailed from out of state. It had described the judge's behavior in chilling detail, but the writer had never come forward. Now, with the arrest public, Marcus hoped that person might feel safe enough to reach out again. Miles away, Jamal walked home slowly, gripping the folded note in his hand like it held the answers to everything. The streets were busy, the usual. Noise of traffic and conversation buzzing around him, but all he could hear was the echo of those 6 words. Call me. I can help you. He finally stopped in front of a corner store, heart pounding, and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, then clicked. A woman's voice came on the line, soft, cautious. Hello? Jamal hesitated. I got your note. There was a pause, then the voice said, I was hoping you'd call. He didn't know what to say next. There were too many questions fighting to come out at once. But she spoke again, gently, like she could hear the fear in his silence. I know your story, and I want to tell you mine. Her name was Claire. She wasn't just a random woman on the bus. She had once been a defense attorney, working quietly on pro bono cases for young people caught up in the system. But after a few too many threats and a personal loss she didn't want to talk about, she had left that life behind. Until the day she saw Jamal. She recognized him from a file she had reviewed years ago, a sealed juvenile record involving a case that never sat right with her. It was a case that had come across the desk of the very same judge Marcus had just arrested. Claire told Jamal that she believed he had been set up, that his case had been mishandled, and that she still had proof. Old notes, emails, copies of missing files. But she needed his trust, and she needed him to talk to someone who could actually do something about it. That night, Jamal barely slept. The idea that someone actually cared enough to track him down. It felt unreal. He had spent most of his teenage years feeling invisible, or worse, targeted. He'd kept his head down, avoided trouble, and kept secrets even his closest friends didn't know. But now, he was starting to wonder if the truth had been buried for a reason. Maybe what happened to him wasn't just bad luck. Maybe it was part of something darker. While Jamal struggled with that decision, Marcus met with his team in a quiet conference room across town. He laid out everything he had seen, not just in court, but in the files and conversations leading up to the sting. What stuck out to him most wasn't just the judge's behavior, but how many people had looked the other way. Prosecutors, bailiffs, other judges. No one said anything. No one had stepped in. The deeper they looked, the more they found. Biased sentencing, disappearing, case notes, probation officers pressured into signing off on deals that didn't make sense. It was a web, and the judge was only one strand in it. If they wanted real change, they'd have to go after the whole thing. And that meant someone,